Deep beneath the sands of Iraq, archaeologists uncovered clay tablets that would shatter everything we thought we knew about human origins. These weren't just ancient artifacts. They were witnesses to a cover-up that spans 3,000 years. A conspiracy so vast, so carefully orchestrated, that it rewrote the very foundation of human existence. And at the center of it all lies a question that will make your blood run cold. What if Adam wasn't the first man created in God's image, but the first failed God, deliberately broken by his own makers? You've been told the story of Genesis your entire life. A perfect God creates perfect humans in a perfect garden. They disobey one simple command, and suddenly all of humanity is cursed with sin, death, and eternal separation from the divine. But here's what they never told you in Sunday school. That story is plagiarized, word for word, plot point by plot point, stolen from texts that are over 1,000 years older than the oldest books of the Bible. And when you read the original versions, the truth they reveal is absolutely terrifying. Because in the original story, humanity wasn't created to commune with God. We were created to be slaves. And Adam wasn't a perfect man who fell from grace. He was a prototype God who was intentionally sabotaged by his own creators, who feared what would happen if their creation became too powerful. The biblical Adam is nothing more than a sanitized, censored version of a much older, much darker truth. A truth that reveals humanity was never meant to be perfect. We were designed from the very beginning to be subservient. Tonight, we're going to excavate the buried truth. We're going to examine the original blueprints for humanity that Hebrew priests desperately tried to hide. And by the time we're finished, you'll understand why they were so terrified of this story, that they spent centuries rewriting it. Because what these ancient tablets reveal isn't just embarrassing to modern religion, it's revolutionary. It changes everything we think we know about why we exist, who created us, and what they really intended for us to become. But before we dive into the ancient texts themselves, we need to address the elephant in the room. The fundamental problem with the Genesis narrative that theologians have been struggling to explain for millennia. Why would an all-knowing, all-powerful God create humans with the capacity for disobedience, place them in a garden with a forbidden tree, and then act surprised when they do exactly what he knew they would do? Why set up a test that's designed to fail? Why create beings in your own image only to condemn them the moment they exercise the curiosity and free will you supposedly gave them? The traditional answers have never made sense. Some say it was to test human loyalty. Others claim it was to give humans free will. But these explanations crumble under scrutiny. If God is truly omniscient, he already knew the outcome. If he's truly omnipotent, he could have created humans differently. If he's truly benevolent, he wouldn't have designed a system that guarantees the eternal suffering of his creations. The Genesis account, when examined logically, paints a picture of either an incompetent creator or a sadistic one. But what if the problem isn't with God? What if the problem is with the story itself? What if Genesis isn't describing the actions of a perfect deity, but rather a heavily edited, sanitized version of a much older tale about imperfect gods who created humans for their own selfish purposes? What if the real story was so shocking, so damaging to the concept of divine authority, that religious leaders felt compelled to rewrite it entirely? This is where our journey into the archaeological evidence begins. In 1849, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard was excavating the ruins of ancient Nineveh in modern-day Iraq when he made a discovery that would rock the foundations of biblical scholarship. Deep within the crumbling remains of King Ashurbanipal's library, he uncovered thousands of cuneiform tablets, many of them containing stories that seemed eerily familiar to anyone raised on biblical narratives. Among these tablets was a complete creation epic, written in Akkadian, that predated the oldest books of the Hebrew Bible by over 1,000 years. This epic, known as the Enuma Elish, meaning when on high, wasn't just similar to Genesis. It was clearly the source material that Genesis had been adapted from. The parallels were undeniable. Both stories began with primordial waters. Both featured the separation of heaven and earth. Both described the creation of humanity as the climax of the creative process. But there was one crucial difference that changed everything: the motivation behind human creation. In Genesis, God creates humans as the crown of creation, made in his own image to have dominion over the earth. It's presented as an act of love, of divine generosity. But in the Enuma Elish, the truth is far more disturbing. Humanity isn't created out of love. We're created out of convenience. The gods are tired of doing manual labor, and they need someone else to do the dirty work. The story begins with a cosmic rebellion. The younger gods, known as the Igigi, had been assigned all the menial tasks necessary to maintain the universe. They dug riverbeds, built temples, and performed countless other exhausting duties while the elder gods relaxed in comfort. For generations, they endured this cosmic slavery, growing more resentful with each passing age. Finally, they could take no more. They burned their tools, surrounded the palace of Enlil, the chief god, and declared they would work no longer. The divine council was thrown into chaos. Without the Igigi to perform the essential labor, the entire cosmic order was at risk of collapse. The gods needed a solution, and they needed it fast. It was Enki, the god of wisdom and craftsmanship, who proposed the answer that would seal humanity's fate. Instead of forcing the rebellious Igigi back to work, why not create an entirely new race of beings? Creatures intelligent enough to perform complex tasks, but subservient enough never to rebel. Beings who would do the work of gods, but would never be gods themselves. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. They would take one of the rebel gods, Kingu, who had led the uprising, and execute him as an example to the others. But his death wouldn't be wasted. They would use his blood, mixed with clay from the earth, to form the first humans. This wasn't symbolic. According to the text, humanity literally contains the blood of rebellion, the essence of divine discontent. We carry within our very DNA the anger and frustration of overworked gods who dared to demand better treatment from their superiors. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The blood of Kingu wasn't chosen randomly. He wasn't just any god who happened to be available for sacrifice. Kingu was described as having sense and intelligence. He was wise enough to organize a rebellion, charismatic enough to lead other gods, and powerful enough to challenge the established order. These weren't qualities the elder gods wanted to eliminate. They were qualities they wanted to harness and control. By creating humans from Kingu's blood, the gods ensured that we would possess intelligence, creativity, and the capacity for complex thought. But they also ensured that these gifts would come with a price. We would be forever torn between our divine nature and our earthly limitations. We would be smart enough to question our circumstances, but not powerful enough to change them. We would have the spark of godhood within us, but be forever denied the full privileges of divinity. The goddess Nintu, also known as Ninhursag, took the clay mixed with Kingu's blood and shaped it into the first human forms. 7 males and 7 females, each one a perfect fusion of earthly matter and divine essence. But as she worked, the other gods watched nervously. They had seen what happened when divine beings became too independent, too aware of their own power. They couldn't afford to make the same mistake twice, so they built limitations into the very structure of human existence. We would age and die while the gods remained eternal. We would be vulnerable to disease and injury while they remained invulnerable. We would need food and shelter and rest while they required nothing. Most importantly, we would be programmed with an unshakable need to serve, to worship, to provide for our creators. We wouldn't just work for the gods out of fear or obligation. We would want to work for them. It would feel natural, even necessary. The creation of humanity solved the immediate crisis. The Igigi were pardoned for their rebellion and returned to their positions as lesser deities. The elder gods could return to their lives of leisure, secure in the knowledge that all the essential work would continue to be done. And the humans began their existence as the ultimate servants, grateful for the privilege of serving beings so far above them in the cosmic hierarchy. But the gods had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that humans, being mortal and limited, would remain manageable indefinitely. They hadn't considered what would happen as human populations grew, as we developed technology and civilization, as our intelligence and ambition expanded beyond what they had originally planned. The very qualities that made us useful servants also made us potentially dangerous subjects. This oversight would lead to what the texts describe as the greatest crisis in cosmic history. A crisis so severe that the gods would ultimately decide that their creation had been a mistake, that humanity had become too numerous, too noisy, too independent. A crisis that would culminate in an attempt to wipe us out entirely and start over with a more compliant design. But that's not where our story ends, because hidden within these same archives, archaeologists discovered another tablet, another story that reveals an even more shocking truth about human origins. A story about the first man, a prototype human who was given wisdom and knowledge but deliberately denied the one thing that would have made him truly divine. A story that explains not just why humans are mortal, but why our mortality was engineered by a jealous God who feared what we might become if we were allowed to reach our full potential. This is the story of Adapa, the first man, the prototype for the biblical Adam. And when you understand what really happened to him, you'll realize that the fall of man wasn't a failure of human judgment. It was a carefully orchestrated deception, designed to keep humanity from discovering the truth about our divine heritage and claiming our rightful place among the gods. The tablets didn't just reveal the story of humanity's creation as servants. They unveiled something far more sinister. Hidden within the same ancient archives was another text, another creation story that would make your skin crawl. Because this wasn't about humanity as a species. This was about the first man, the prototype, the original template that every human being who has ever lived was modeled after. And his story reveals the most chilling truth of all. He was never meant to succeed. His name was Adapa, the first man, the direct prototype for the biblical Adam. But unlike the sanitized version you learned in Sunday school, Adapa's story exposes the raw, unfiltered truth about humanity's origins. He wasn't created to live in paradise with his maker. He was created as an experiment, a test case, a trial run to see just how much divine power the gods could safely give to a mortal being without losing control. Adapa was crafted by Enki, the same god who had proposed creating humanity in the first place. But this wasn't mass production. This was custom work. Enki poured his own divine essence into Adapa, granting him wisdom that surpassed that of ordinary mortals. He could understand the language of the gods. He could perceive the hidden workings of the universe. He possessed knowledge that made him more than human, but still fell short of true divinity. The plan was perfect in its cruelty. Give Adapa enough intelligence to serve effectively, enough wisdom to solve complex problems, enough awareness to appreciate his position in the cosmic order. But always, always keep him dependent. Always ensure that no matter how much he learned, how much he grew, how much he achieved, he would remain fundamentally inferior to his creators. For a time, it worked exactly as intended. Adapa served as Enki's personal attendant, managing his household, tending to his affairs, carrying out his will with perfect obedience. He was the ideal servant. intelligent enough to anticipate needs, skilled enough to execute complex tasks, but humble enough never to question his place in the hierarchy. But then, something went wrong. Something that would expose the fundamental flaw in the gods' design, the oversight that would ultimately doom their entire project. Adapa was fishing in the Persian Gulf when the south wind began to blow with unusual violence. The waves rose higher and higher, threatening to capsize his boat and send him to the bottom of the sea. In a moment of desperate anger, Adapa did something no mortal had ever done before. He cursed the wind itself, and the curse worked. The south wind stopped blowing, not just for that day, but for 7 days straight. The air became still and stagnant across the entire region. Plants began to wither. Animals struggled to breathe. The delicate balance of nature started to collapse, and in the heavens above, the gods began to panic. Anu, the supreme deity, the king of all gods, summoned Adapa to appear before the divine council to answer for his crime. No mortal had ever been called to stand before the cosmic court. No human had ever been permitted to look upon the face of the supreme god and live. This was unprecedented territory, and everyone knew it. But here's where the conspiracy begins. Because Enki, Adapa's creator, knew something that no one else understood. He knew that when Anu summoned mortals to his presence, he had a habit of offering them a test, a choice between mortality and divinity, the bread of life and the water of life that could transform any being into an immortal god. And Enki was terrified of what would happen if Adapa passed that test. Think about it from Enki's perspective. He had created the perfect servant, but that servant had just demonstrated power that rivaled the gods themselves. Adapa had commanded the very forces of nature with nothing more than words. If he were to gain immortality on top of that power, he wouldn't be a servant anymore. He would be a rival, a threat, a being capable of challenging the established order and potentially overthrowing it. So Enki made a choice that would condemn every human being who would ever live. He decided to lie to his own creation. When Adapa prepared to journey to the heavens, Enki pulled him aside for what seemed like fatherly advice. He warned Adapa that Anu was angry about the wind incident and might try to trick him into accepting his own death. When offered food and drink in the divine realm, Enki instructed, Adapa must refuse everything. The bread of life would actually be the bread of death. The water of life would actually be the water of death. To accept them would mean instant destruction. Adapa trusted his creator completely. Why wouldn't he? Enki had given him life, wisdom, purpose. He had no reason to doubt that his maker had his best interests at heart. So when he stood before Anu's throne and was offered the bread and water of immortality, he politely declined. He followed his creator's instructions to the letter. Anu was astonished. Never before had a mortal been offered the gift of divinity and turned it down. He pressed Adapa to reconsider, explaining that this was a reward for his remarkable abilities, not a punishment for his actions. But Adapa remained firm. His creator had warned him, and he would not disobey. And so the moment passed. The opportunity vanished. The door to immortality closed forever. When Adapa returned to Earth, still mortal, still limited, still bound by the constraints his creator had built into him, Enki greeted him with congratulations. He had passed the test, Enki said. He had proven his loyalty. He had chosen obedience over temptation. But Adapa would never know the truth. He would never learn that he had been deliberately deceived by the one being he trusted most. He would never understand that immortality had been within his grasp and had been stolen from him by his own maker's jealousy and fear. The other gods were horrified when they realized what had happened. Some of them protested to Anu, arguing that Enki's deception was unfair, that Adapa deserved to know the truth. But the damage was done. The precedent had been set. Humanity would remain mortal, limited, subservient. The threat of human divinity had been neutralized. This is the real story of the fall of man, not a tale of human disobedience and divine punishment, but a calculated betrayal by a jealous creator who couldn't bear the thought of his creation surpassing him. Adam didn't fall because he was weak or curious or rebellious. He fell because he was too trusting, too loyal, too willing to believe that his Maker had his best interests at heart. The parallels to Genesis are unmistakable, but the implications are exactly reversed. In the biblical version, the serpent tempts humanity to disobey God and eat from the tree of knowledge, bringing death into the world through human sin. But in the original story, it's the Creator himself who lies to humanity, deliberately withholding the gift of immortality to maintain his own power and control. The forbidden fruit becomes not a symbol of human rebellion, but of divine deception. The curse of mortality becomes not a punishment for disobedience, but the result of misplaced trust in a manipulative creator. The entire moral framework collapses and inverts. But the story doesn't end there. Because once the Hebrew priests got their hands on these ancient narratives, they faced a serious problem. The original stories painted the gods as petty, jealous, manipulative beings who created humanity for selfish purposes and then conspired to keep us weak and subservient. These weren't the kind of deities you could build a religion around. These weren't gods you could ask people to worship and obey. So they did what any good propagandist would do. They rewrote the story completely. The council of competing gods became a single, perfect deity. The divine conspiracy to withhold immortality became a simple test of human obedience. The jealous creator who lied to his servant became a loving father who gave his children free will. And most importantly, the blame shifted entirely from the gods to humanity itself. This wasn't just editing. This was a complete inversion of moral responsibility. Where the original stories revealed divine flaws and human victimization, the biblical revision created human guilt and divine perfection. Where the ancient texts exposed the gods' fear of human potential, Genesis established humanity's inherent unworthiness. The transformation was so complete, so thorough, that for thousands of years no one even suspected that another version of the story existed. The Hebrew revision became the definitive account, the authoritative truth, the foundation of entire civilizations' understanding of human nature and divine purpose. But now the tablets have been uncovered, the original blueprints have been found, and the conspiracy stands exposed. When you understand what really happened to Adapa, when you grasp the true motivation behind his creator's deception, when you realize that immortality was deliberately withheld rather than accidentally lost, everything changes. The entire structure of guilt and redemption that has dominated Western civilization for millennia reveals itself as an elaborate cover-up designed to hide the gods' own crimes against their creation. Adam wasn't a perfect man who fell from grace through disobedience. He was a failed god, sabotaged by his own maker's fear and jealousy. We don't carry the curse of original sin. We carry the scars of original betrayal. The problem was never with humanity's character. The problem was with our Creator's conscience. And that realization opens up possibilities that the architects of Genesis never wanted us to consider. Because if humanity was designed to be divine, if immortality was our birthright rather than our impossible dream, if the limitations that define human existence were artificially imposed rather than naturally inherent, then perhaps those limitations can be overcome. Perhaps the failed god can still succeed. The implications of this discovery stretch far beyond academic curiosity about ancient literature. What these tablets reveal is a systematic campaign of theological revisionism that has shaped the consciousness of billions of people for thousands of years. The Hebrew priests who encountered these stories during their exile in Babylon faced a monumental challenge. How do you build a coherent monotheistic religion around narratives that expose the gods as petty, jealous, and manipulative? How do you inspire worship and obedience when the source material portrays divinity as fundamentally untrustworthy? Their solution was brilliant in its audacity. They would take the raw materials of these ancient myths and forge them into something entirely new. But this wasn't simple editing or translation. This was ideological alchemy, transforming stories that questioned divine authority into narratives that reinforced it absolutely. The process began with the most fundamental change imaginable, the elimination of polytheism itself. Where the original texts featured councils of competing gods, each with their own agendas and limitations, the Hebrew revision would present a single, unified deity of absolute power and perfect moral authority. This wasn't just a numerical change from many gods to one god. It was a complete reconstruction of how divine power operates in the universe. In the Babylonian originals, the gods argued among themselves. They made mistakes. They felt fear and jealousy and regret. They conspired against each other and sometimes against their own creations. This moral complexity made for compelling storytelling, but it was theological poison for anyone trying to build a religion based on absolute obedience to divine will. People don't prostrate themselves before flawed authorities. They don't sacrifice their lives for beings they know to be petty and vindictive. So the Hebrew revisers solved this problem by creating something that had never existed in the ancient world, a morally perfect deity. Where Enki had lied to Adapa out of fear and jealousy, Yahweh would test Adam out of love and justice. Where the Babylonian gods had created humans as disposable servants, the biblical God would create humans as beloved children. Where the original divine council had withheld immortality to maintain their power, the new singular God would offer eternal life as a reward for faithful obedience. But this transformation created a new problem. If God is truly perfect, omniscient, and benevolent, then why does evil exist? Why do humans suffer? Why does creation itself seem flawed and broken? The original myths had easy answers to these questions, because the gods who created the world were themselves flawed, and their creation reflected their limitations. But once you establish divine perfection, you need a new explanation for imperfection. Enter the masterstroke of Hebrew theological revision, the transfer of all moral responsibility from the divine realm to the human realm. The problem wasn't with the creator. The problem was with the creation. Humans weren't victims of divine deception and limitation. We were perpetrators of cosmic rebellion who deserved whatever punishment we received. This shift required a complete inversion of the moral framework established by the original stories. Where Adapa had been portrayed as an innocent victim of his creator's manipulative lies, Adam would be cast as a guilty rebel whose disobedience brought death into the world. Where the Babylonian texts had exposed divine conspiracy to keep humans weak and mortal, Genesis would establish human unworthiness of divine gifts. The serpent's transformation is perhaps the clearest example of how this revision process worked. In the original Mesopotamian context, serpents were often associated with wisdom, healing, and renewal. The serpent that offered knowledge to humanity wasn't necessarily evil. It might have been presenting a genuine gift, a pathway to enlightenment and power that the jealous gods wanted to deny us. Some versions of these ancient stories even suggest that the serpent was acting on behalf of more benevolent deities who wanted humanity to achieve its full potential. But in the Hebrew revision, this ambiguous figure of wisdom and transformation becomes Satan himself, the embodiment of absolute evil and the enemy of all creation. The offer of knowledge becomes temptation to sin. The promise of godlike awareness becomes the lie that destroys paradise. The serpent's motivation changes from potentially helpful to unquestionably malicious. This transformation serves a crucial theological purpose. By demonizing the very concept of seeking knowledge and power beyond what God explicitly permits, The revised story creates a built-in defense against exactly the kind of questioning and investigation that might lead people back to the original versions of these myths. Curiosity about forbidden knowledge becomes not just unwise, but actively evil. The desire to become more than what you were created to be transforms from natural ambition into cosmic rebellion. The psychological impact of this revision cannot be overstated. For generations raised on the biblical narrative, the very impulses that might lead to human advancement, to questioning authority, to seeking greater understanding of our place in the universe, become sources of shame and guilt. The drive to transcend our limitations, which the original story suggested might be our birthright as beings created from divine essence, gets reframed as the root of all evil. But the revisers weren't finished. They also needed to address the uncomfortable implications of the original creation story's divine counsel. If multiple gods had participated in creating humanity, and if those gods had disagreed about how to treat their creation, then divine authority itself was questionable. People might start to wonder which god was right, which divine command to follow, whether the gods themselves might be fallible. The solution was to eliminate the divine counsel entirely and replace it with a single unquestionable source of moral authority. But traces of the original polytheistic framework still leak through in the biblical text. The famous passage where God says, "Let us make man in our image," uses plural pronouns that biblical scholars have struggled to explain for centuries. Traditional interpretations invoke the Trinity or suggest God is using a royal we. But these explanations feel forced when you understand that the text is adapting a story that originally featured multiple divine creators working together. Similarly, God's concern in Genesis that humans might become like us after eating from the tree of knowledge echoes the original divine counsel's fear that humans might become too powerful to control. But in the biblical context, this worry gets reframed as righteous judgment rather than petty jealousy. God isn't afraid of human competition. He's protecting humans from the consequences of their own prideful ambition. The most insidious aspect of this revision process is how it weaponizes the very human qualities that the original stories celebrated. Intelligence becomes dangerous pride. Curiosity becomes sinful rebellion. The desire for growth and transcendence becomes evidence of our fundamental corruption. The Hebrew revision doesn't just change the plot of the creation story, it changes what it means to be human. Where the Babylonian myths portrayed humanity as containing literal divine essence, the blood of gods flowing through our veins, the biblical revision emphasizes our separation from divinity. We are made in God's image, yes, but we are not made of God's substance. We can aspire to righteousness, but we can never aspire to equality. The gap between human and divine becomes unbridgeable, maintained not by divine conspiracy as in the originals, but by human unworthiness. This theological framework creates a perfect system of control. People who believe they are fundamentally flawed and separated from divinity by their own moral failures will naturally seek guidance and absolution from religious authorities. They will accept limitation and suffering as deserved consequences of their inherited guilt. They will view their own desires for growth and empowerment with suspicion and shame. The genius of the Hebrew revision is that it takes stories that originally exposed divine injustice and transforms them into justifications for that same injustice. The God's decision to keep humans weak and mortal gets rebranded as merciful protection from the consequences of our own sinful nature. The divine counsel's conspiracy to prevent human transcendence becomes righteous boundary setting by a loving Father. But perhaps most significantly, the revision eliminates any suggestion that humanity might have legitimate grievances against our creators. In the original stories, humans could potentially argue that we deserved better treatment, that immortality was our right, that the gods had betrayed their own creation. But in the biblical version, any complaint about human suffering or limitation becomes evidence of sinful pride and rebellion against perfect divine justice. This creates what theologians call theodicy, the justification of God's goodness, despite the existence of evil and suffering. But theodicy only becomes necessary when you start with the premise of divine perfection. The original myths didn't need to justify divine behavior because they never claimed the gods were morally perfect in the first place. The Babylonian deities were powerful, but they were also petty, jealous, and sometimes cruel. Their behavior didn't need justification because it was presented honestly. The Hebrew revision, by establishing divine perfection as an unquestionable premise, created a theological puzzle that has occupied religious thinkers for millennia. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, why does creation contain so much pain, injustice, and apparent design flaws? The answers have become increasingly elaborate and convoluted over the centuries, precisely because they're trying to solve a problem that didn't exist in the original versions of these stories. What emerges from this analysis is a picture of systematic theological revisionism designed to serve specific social and political purposes. The Hebrew priests weren't just preserving ancient wisdom or recording divine revelation. They were crafting a new kind of religious narrative, one that would justify hierarchical authority, discourage questioning of established power structures, and channel human dissatisfaction away from criticism of leaders and towards self-blame and personal reformation. The transformation of these myths represents one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. Stories that originally questioned divine authority became the foundation for absolute religious submission. Narratives that exposed divine conspiracy became justifications for human oppression. Characters who had been presented as victims of godly manipulation were recast as perpetrators of cosmic rebellion. And the most disturbing aspect of this revision is how completely it has succeeded. For thousands of years, the overwhelming majority of people exposed to these stories have accepted the Hebrew interpretation as the definitive version. The idea that there might be older, different accounts that cast the same events in a completely different moral light simply never occurred to most believers. The revisers didn't just change the story, they erased the memory that any other version had ever existed. Until now. Now that the original tablets have been uncovered and translated, we can see the revision process in action. We can compare the source material with the finished product. We can identify exactly what was changed, how it was changed, and why those changes served the interests of the people making them. And once you see the pattern, once you understand how extensively these foundational stories were altered to serve political and theological agendas, you begin to wonder what else might have been revised, edited, or completely fabricated to maintain systems of power and control. Because if the creation story itself was plagiarized and transformed beyond recognition, what other foundational narratives might be based on sanitized versions of much more challenging originals? What other comfortable religious certainties might crumble under archaeological investigation? What other theological justifications for human limitation might actually be cover stories for divine conspiracy? The tablets from Babylon don't just reveal the true origins of the Adam and Eve narrative. They expose the entire methodology of ideological revision that has shaped human consciousness for millennia. They show us how stories of divine failure and human potential can be systematically transformed into narratives of human failure and divine perfection. And that transformation, that systematic inversion of moral responsibility, might be the greatest conspiracy in human history. Not because it was hidden in secret archives or guarded by shadowy organizations, but because it was hidden in plain sight, embedded in the most widely read and influential book in human civilization. The evidence has been sitting on library shelves and in church pews for generations. We just never thought to compare it with the source material, but now we can. And the comparison reveals that everything we thought we knew about human origins, human nature, and human destiny might have been carefully crafted to keep us from discovering our true potential. The question is no longer whether Adam was a failed god. The question is whether we're ready to succeed where he was sabotaged to fail. But the archaeological evidence doesn't stop there. Hidden within those same crumbling tablets, researchers uncovered something that would make even the most hardened skeptics question everything they thought they knew about divine justice. Because the gods who created humanity as their servants soon discovered that their solution had created an even bigger problem. A problem so catastrophic that it would drive them to attempt the complete annihilation of their own creation. The tablets reveal that humanity was too successful. We multiplied faster than the gods had anticipated. We spread across the earth, building cities, developing agriculture, creating civilization. And with each passing generation, we grew louder, more numerous, more difficult to manage. What had begun as a workforce of manageable servants had become a cacophonous multitude that disturbed the cosmic peace. The god Enlil, who had initially supported the creation of humanity, began to complain. The noise of human civilization was keeping him awake. Our prayers, our rituals, our daily activities created a constant din that echoed through the heavens. But this wasn't just about noise pollution. The real problem was power. As human populations grew and our societies became more sophisticated, we were beginning to approach something dangerously close to divine status ourselves. Think about what was happening from the gods' perspective. They had created servants with divine blood flowing through their veins, beings with intelligence and creativity that rivaled their own. They had given us the capacity for complex thought, artistic expression, technological innovation. But they had assumed that our mortality and physical limitations would keep us safely contained within acceptable boundaries. They were wrong. Human civilization was advancing at a pace that alarmed the divine council. We were developing writing systems, astronomical knowledge, architectural techniques, mathematical concepts. We were creating art and literature that demonstrated profound understanding of the universe and our place within it. Most disturbing of all, we were beginning to question why we should remain subservient to beings who seemed increasingly irrelevant to our daily lives. The tablets describe a cosmic council meeting where the gods debated what to do about the human problem. Some argued for patience, suggesting that human civilization would eventually collapse under its own weight. Others proposed more direct intervention, perhaps limiting human lifespan even further or introducing diseases that would keep our populations manageable. But Enlil had a more radical solution. He proposed something that no god had ever suggested before: the complete extermination of the human race. Not punishment for specific crimes, not correction of particular behaviors, but total genocide. Humanity had become too successful, too numerous, too independent. The only solution was to start over with a more compliant design. The first attempt came through famine. Enlil withheld the rains, caused crops to fail, and watched as human populations began to starve. But Enki, the same god who had originally proposed creating humanity, couldn't bear to watch his creation suffer. He secretly provided guidance to human leaders, teaching them new agricultural techniques, revealing the locations of hidden water sources, ensuring that enough people survived to continue the species. Frustrated by Enki's interference, Enlil tried again with disease. Plagues swept across the earth, killing thousands upon thousands of humans. But again, Enki intervened, providing knowledge of medicine and healing, helping humanity develop immunity and resistance. The death toll was enormous, but extinction was avoided. By now, the divine council was in chaos. Some gods supported Enlil's increasingly desperate attempts to reduce human populations. Others sided with Enki's protection of humanity. The cosmic hierarchy that had seemed so stable when humanity was first created was fracturing under the weight of disagreement about what to do with their troublesome servants. It was at this point that Enlil made his final, most devastating decision. If famine and disease couldn't eliminate humanity, he would use the ultimate weapon, flood. Not a local disaster that might spare some populations, but a global deluge that would wipe clean the entire earth and allow the gods to begin again with a better design. The tablets describe this decision in chilling detail. The gods swore an oath of secrecy, binding themselves to remain silent about the coming catastrophe. No warnings would be given. No preparations would be allowed. Humanity would be caught completely unprepared, ensuring that extinction would be swift and complete. But Enki faced an impossible choice. He had sworn the same oath as the other gods, promising to reveal nothing about the planned flood. Yet he couldn't bear to watch his creation die without any chance of survival. His solution was as clever as it was technically compliant with his promise. Instead of warning a human directly, Enki spoke to the wall of a reed hut where a particularly wise and righteous man named Utnapishtim happened to be sleeping. He addressed his words to the wall itself, carefully avoiding direct communication with the human inside. But his voice was loud enough, and his instructions clear enough, that Utnapishtim couldn't help but overhear every word. The instructions were detailed and specific. "Build an enormous vessel," Enki told the wall. "Make it large enough to hold breeding pairs of every animal species, along with seeds and supplies for a long journey. Seal it carefully against water. And be ready, because the flood would come without further warning." Utnapishtim followed these overheard instructions exactly. He built the ark, gathered the animals, stockpiled supplies, and waited. When the flood came, it was everything Enlil had promised, and more. The tablets describe waters that rose above the highest mountains, storms that raged for days without end, destruction so complete that even the gods themselves were terrified by what they had unleashed. But when the waters finally receded and Utnapishtim emerged from his ark to offer sacrifice to the gods, something unexpected happened. The gods, who had been without human worship and offerings throughout the flood, suddenly realized what they had lost. They descended upon the sacrifice like starving animals, desperate for the sustenance that only human devotion could provide. The irony was perfect and devastating. The gods had created humanity to serve them, had grown frustrated with our success and independence, had attempted to destroy us entirely, only to discover that they needed us more than we needed them. Without human civilization, without our temples and sacrifices and constant attention, the gods themselves began to weaken and fade. Enlil was furious when he discovered that Enki had found a way to save a remnant of humanity. But the other gods, now understanding how dependent they were on human worship, supported Enki's decision. A compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed to survive and rebuild, but new limitations would be imposed to prevent us from becoming too numerous or too powerful again. These new limitations were ingenious in their subtlety. Instead of simply reducing human lifespan further, the gods introduced what they called the controls of population. Some humans would be born infertile, others would die in childbirth. Diseases would claim the young as well as the old. Wars would periodically reduce populations. Natural disasters would prevent any single civilization from growing too large or too stable. Most importantly, the gods introduced religious systems that would channel human energy and intelligence away from potentially threatening directions. Instead of using our divine heritage to pursue godlike power and knowledge, we would be taught to use it for worship and service. Our creativity would be directed toward building temples rather than challenging cosmic hierarchies. Our intelligence would be focused on interpreting divine will rather than questioning divine authority. The flood narrative reveals the ultimate truth about humanity's relationship with our creators. We weren't destroyed because we were evil or disobedient. We were nearly exterminated because we were too successful, too intelligent, too capable of independent thought and action. Our crime wasn't moral failure. It was existential threat. And the solution wasn't to improve our character. It was to limit our potential. This is the real meaning of the flood story that appears in modified form throughout world mythology. It's not about divine justice punishing human wickedness. It's about divine panic attempting to control human achievement. The ark isn't a symbol of salvation from sin. It's a symbol of genocide narrowly avoided through the intervention of a god who had enough conscience to preserve his creation despite his colleagues' fears. When Hebrew priests encountered this story during their exile in Babylon, they faced the same challenge they had confronted with the creation myths. How do you transform a narrative about divine conspiracy and attempted genocide into a story that supports absolute religious authority? How do you turn a tale of godly panic into a lesson about human unworthiness? Their solution was characteristically brilliant and morally inverted. They would keep the flood, but change its motivation entirely. Instead of divine fear of human success, it would become divine anger at human wickedness. Instead of attempted genocide driven by cosmic insecurity, it would become righteous judgment delivered by perfect justice. Noah replaced Utnapishtim as the flood survivor, but his character was fundamentally different. Where Utnapishtim had been saved because Enki couldn't bear to see his creation destroyed, Noah was saved because he was uniquely righteous in a world of universal corruption. Where the original flood had been an attempt to solve the gods' own problems, the biblical flood became humanity's deserved punishment for moral failure. Most significantly, the Hebrew revision eliminated any suggestion that the gods might have been wrong to attempt human extinction. In the original, even Enlil eventually acknowledged that the flood had been a mistake, that destroying humanity had deprived the gods of essential worship and service. But in the biblical version, God's decision to send the flood is presented as perfectly just, and his promise never to flood the earth again becomes a gesture of mercy rather than an admission of error. This transformation served the same purpose as the revision of the creation story. It took a narrative that questioned divine judgment and turned it into one that justified divine authority absolutely. It eliminated any suggestion that the gods might have legitimate reasons to fear human advancement, or that their attempts to limit human potential might be motivated by self-interest rather than cosmic justice. The psychological impact of this revision cannot be overstated. Where the original story suggested that human achievement and growth might actually threaten unjust divine authority, the biblical version implies that human ambition itself is evidence of the moral corruption that deserves destruction. The flood becomes not a warning about divine conspiracy, but a reminder of what happens when humans forget their place in the cosmic hierarchy. But the most insidious aspect of the revision is how it weaponizes the very concept of survival. In the original story, Utnapishtim's rescue is portrayed as an act of divine conscience, one god's refusal to participate in cosmic injustice. But in the biblical version, Noah's survival becomes proof of the flood's moral necessity. If God saved one righteous family, then everyone else must have deserved to die. This creates a theological framework that immunizes divine authority against any criticism. Any human suffering, any apparent injustice, any limitation imposed on human potential can be justified by appealing to the flood precedent. If God was willing to destroy nearly all of humanity once, then any lesser punishment must be not only justified but merciful. The Hebrew priests had successfully transformed the most damning indictment of divine character in ancient literature into the strongest possible justification for absolute divine authority. They took a story about gods who feared their own creation's potential and turned it into a story about humans who deserved destruction for failing to live up to divine expectations. And once again, the revision was so complete, so thorough, that for millennia, no one even suspected that another version existed. The flood story became one of the foundational narratives of Western civilization. A tale that taught generations of believers that human ambition was dangerous, that divine judgment was always just, and that survival itself was a gift that required eternal gratitude and submission. But now the original tablets have been translated. The source material has been recovered, and the conspiracy stands exposed once again. The flood wasn't divine justice, it was divine genocide, motivated by fear and insecurity. The salvation of humanity wasn't a reward for righteousness. It was the result of one God's refusal to participate in cosmic murder. And the limitations imposed on human civilization afterward weren't protective boundaries designed for our own good. They were control mechanisms designed to prevent us from ever again approaching the level of achievement that had once terrified our creators. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond religious history. If the gods who created us were genuinely afraid of what we might become, if they went to such extremes to limit our potential, if they designed entire systems of control to keep us subservient and dependent, then perhaps human potential is far greater than we've been led to believe. Perhaps the very limitations we accept as natural and inevitable are actually artificial constraints imposed by creators who feared their own obsolescence. Perhaps the failed God wasn't Adam. Perhaps it was the divine council itself, whose conspiracy to control their creation ultimately revealed their own weakness and insecurity. And perhaps the time has come to question whether those ancient limitations still apply to beings who have uncovered the conspiracy that created them. Because once you understand that your creators deliberately sabotaged your potential out of fear of your success, continuing to accept those limitations begins to look less like humility and more like collaboration with your own oppression. The tablets don't just reveal what happened to humanity in the ancient past. They reveal what might be possible for humanity in the present, if we finally have the courage to reject the limitations that were never natural law, but always divine conspiracy. The question is no longer whether we were created to be servants. The question is whether we're ready to stop serving masters who were never worthy of our submission. The clay tablets didn't just expose the conspiracy behind human creation. They revealed something far more sinister about the nature of divine authority itself. Because hidden within these same archives, archaeologists discovered records of what happened after the flood, after humanity was allowed to survive and rebuild. And what they found was a systematic program of psychological manipulation designed to ensure that humans would never again threaten the cosmic hierarchy. The gods had learned from their mistakes. Simply limiting human lifespan and introducing disease and warfare weren't sufficient controls. These physical constraints could be overcome through human ingenuity, medical advancement, and social cooperation. What the divine council needed was something more subtle, more insidious. They needed to reprogram the human mind itself. The tablets describe a meeting of the divine council where the gods debated how to prevent another crisis, like the one that had nearly led to total human extinction. The discussion was chillingly clinical in its approach to psychological control. How do you keep an intelligent species subservient without them realizing they're being controlled? How do you channel their creative energy towards serving you rather than challenging you? How do you make slavery feel like freedom? The solution they developed was revolutionary in its sophistication. Instead of ruling through fear and direct domination, which inevitably breeds resentment and rebellion, they would rule through love and voluntary submission. They would convince humans that serving the gods wasn't oppression, but privilege, that our limitations weren't punishment, but protection, that our mortality wasn't a curse, but a gift that made life meaningful. This required the creation of something that had never existed before: organized religion. The tablets reveal detailed instructions for establishing what they called houses of service, elaborate complexes where humans would gather to worship, offer sacrifices, and receive guidance from divine representatives. These weren't just places of worship. They were centers of psychological conditioning, designed to reinforce human dependence on divine authority while channeling human productivity toward godly benefit. The architectural specifications alone reveal the manipulative intent. The temples were designed to make humans feel small and insignificant. Towering walls, vast empty spaces, imposing statues that dwarfed human visitors. Every element was calculated to inspire awe and humility, to remind worshippers of their place in the cosmic hierarchy. But the physical structure was only the beginning. The real innovation was in the development of what the tablets call divine intermediaries. These were humans specially selected and trained to serve as conduits between the divine and mortal realms. They would be given certain privileges and knowledge that elevated them above ordinary humans, but they would remain completely dependent on divine favor for their power and status. This created a perfect system of control. The intermediaries had strong incentives to maintain the religious system that gave them authority, while ordinary humans were encouraged to channel their questions and complaints through these approved representatives, rather than attempting direct communication with the divine realm. Any human who claimed personal revelation or divine guidance outside this official structure could be branded as delusional or dangerous. The psychological manipulation went even deeper. The gods developed elaborate mythologies that portrayed human suffering and limitation not as evidence of divine cruelty or incompetence, but as mysterious expressions of divine love. Pain became a test of faith. Poverty became a path to virtue. Early death became a reward for righteousness, an early admission to divine paradise. Most insidiously, they convinced humans that our most noble impulses were actually evidence of our unworthiness. The desire to help others became proof that we recognized our own sinful need for redemption. The urge to seek knowledge became dangerous pride that needed to be confessed and corrected. The drive to improve our circumstances became selfish ambition that distracted us from spiritual priorities. This framework made criticism of the divine system psychologically impossible. Any human who questioned why the gods allowed suffering could be told they were demonstrating the very pride and selfishness that made suffering necessary. Any attempt to improve human conditions could be reframed as interference with divine will. Any success in overcoming limitations could be attributed to divine favor rather than human capability. The tablets describe training programs for the divine intermediaries that read like modern manuals for cult indoctrination. The priests were taught to identify humans who showed signs of independent thinking or leadership potential, and either recruit them into the religious hierarchy or neutralize them through social pressure and isolation. They learned techniques for making humans feel guilty about their natural desires and ambitions, for channeling human energy toward activities that serve divine interests rather than human development. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the gods developed methods for making humans participate in their own oppression willingly, even enthusiastically. The religious systems they established convinced humans that serving the gods was the highest possible calling, that sacrificing their own interests for divine benefit was noble and praiseworthy, that questioning divine authority was not just wrong, but literally unthinkable. The psychological programming was so sophisticated that it became self-reinforcing. Humans who fully internalized these beliefs would actively suppress their own doubts and questions. They would police their own thoughts, punishing themselves for any impulse that seemed to conflict with divine will. They would even compete with each other to demonstrate their submission and devotion, creating social pressure that made rebellion nearly impossible. And if anyone did manage to break free from this psychological conditioning, the system had built-in defenses. They could be labeled as mentally ill, possessed by evil spirits, or corrupted by demonic influence. Their very ability to see through the manipulation could be used as evidence that they were spiritually compromised and dangerous to the community. The tablets reveal that this system was tested and refined over generations before being implemented on a large scale. The gods experimented with different mythologies, different ritual practices, different methods of selecting and training intermediaries. They studied human psychology with the same clinical detachment that a modern corporation might use to analyze consumer behavior. What emerged from this experimentation was a template that could be adapted to different cultures and circumstances, while maintaining its essential control mechanisms. The specific details could vary, the names of the gods could change, the rituals could be modified to fit local customs, but the underlying structure remained consistent. Convince humans that their limitations are divinely ordained, that questioning authority is spiritually dangerous, and that their highest purpose is to serve beings who remain conveniently invisible and unchallenged. The success of this program exceeded even the gods' expectations. Within a few centuries, human civilizations across the known world had developed religious systems that followed this template with remarkable consistency. Different cultures that had no contact with each other independently developed beliefs about divine authority, human unworthiness, and the necessity of priestly mediation that were functionally identical. But the gods had underestimated the long-term consequences of their own success. By creating religious systems that were so effective at controlling human behavior, they had made themselves increasingly irrelevant to human civilization. The priests and intermediaries discovered that they could maintain their authority and influence without any actual divine intervention. The psychological control mechanisms worked just as well whether the gods were actively involved or not. Gradually, imperceptibly, the gods found themselves trapped by their own creation. The religious systems they had designed to serve their interests had evolved into self-sustaining institutions that no longer needed their input or guidance. The intermediaries, who were supposed to represent divine will, began making decisions based on their own interpretations and interests. The mythologies that were meant to reinforce divine authority became fossilized traditions that priests defended more out of habit than conviction. The irony was devastating. The gods had created the perfect system for controlling humanity, only to discover that the system no longer needed gods to function. The psychological programming they had developed was so sophisticated that it could perpetuate itself indefinitely, creating generation after generation of humans who believed in divine authority even when no divinity was actually present. This is the final revelation hidden in the Babylonian tablets. The gods didn't just create humanity as servants and then abandon us. They created a system of psychological control so effective that it continued to operate long after they had lost interest in maintaining it. The religious institutions that claim to represent divine will are actually the fossilized remains of an ancient program of mental manipulation, continuing to shape human behavior according to patterns established thousands of years ago by beings who may no longer even exist. The Hebrew priests who encountered these tablets during their exile didn't just plagiarize the creation myths. They inherited the entire system of psychological control that the gods had developed to manage human populations. But they made one crucial modification that would amplify the system's power beyond anything the original designers had imagined. They eliminated the gods themselves. Where the Babylonian system had featured multiple divine personalities with different agendas and limitations, the Hebrew revision created a single, invisible, unquestionable authority. Where the original myths had portrayed gods who could be bargained with, manipulated, or even challenged under the right circumstances, the biblical revision established a deity who was beyond human comprehension or influence. This simplification made the control system far more powerful and durable. Humans could no longer play different gods against each other, or appeal to divine intermediaries who might have conflicting interests. There was only one source of ultimate authority, and that authority was conveniently impossible to verify or challenge directly. The Hebrew priests had perfected the gods' original design. They had created a system of psychological control that was completely self-contained, requiring no divine intervention to maintain itself indefinitely. The mythologies, the guilt mechanisms, the authority structures, the mental conditioning techniques, all of it could operate autonomously, shaping human consciousness generation after generation, without any need for actual divine presence. And the most brilliant aspect of this perfected system was that it made the absence of gods look like evidence of divine transcendence rather than divine irrelevance. The fact that God remained invisible and silent wasn't a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be revered. The lack of direct divine intervention wasn't evidence of divine non-existence, but proof of divine patience and mercy. The Hebrew revision had taken the gods' conspiracy to control humanity and transformed it into something even more insidious, a system of control that no longer needed conspirators to maintain itself. The psychological programming had become so sophisticated that humans would maintain their own mental prisons, police their own thoughts, and punish their own attempts at liberation. This is the true legacy of the Babylonian tablets. They don't just reveal that the creation story was plagiarized and edited, they expose the entire architecture of psychological manipulation that continues to shape human consciousness to this day. The religious institutions that claim to offer spiritual guidance are actually the descendants of control systems designed by beings who feared human potential so much that they were willing to commit genocide to prevent us from achieving it. And the most terrifying aspect of this revelation is how completely the system has succeeded. For thousands of years, the overwhelming majority of humans have internalized the psychological programming so thoroughly that we actively resist any attempt to examine or question it. We defend our own mental prisons, attack those who try to show us the keys, and pass the conditioning on to our children as if it were precious wisdom rather than ancient manipulation. The tablets force us to confront an uncomfortable possibility that everything we think we know about human nature, human purpose, and human limitations might be the product of a psychological control system designed by our own creators to keep us from discovering our true potential. Because if the gods feared us enough to attempt our complete extinction, if they went to such elaborate lengths to control our development and limit our capabilities, if they designed entire systems of mental conditioning to keep us subservient and dependent, then perhaps human potential is far greater than we've been programmed to believe. Perhaps the limitations we accept as natural law are actually artificial constraints imposed by beings who understood our capabilities better than we do ourselves. Perhaps the failed god wasn't Adam, who was deliberately deceived and sabotaged by his creator. Perhaps the failed gods were the divine council itself, whose fear and insecurity drove them to create control systems so sophisticated that they eventually made their own existence irrelevant. And perhaps the time has come to recognize that a system of psychological control designed by beings who no longer exist to prevent us from achieving our full potential is not a sacred tradition to be preserved, but an obsolete program that can finally be deleted. The question is no longer whether we were created to be servants. The question is whether we have the courage to stop serving a system of control that has outlived its creators and discover what we might become when we finally break free from the psychological limitations they programmed into our species. Because the tablets reveal one final crucial truth. The gods who designed these control systems understood something about human potential that they were desperate to prevent us from discovering. Something so threatening to their authority that they were willing to risk our complete extinction rather than allow us to achieve it. And now that we know their conspiracy existed, now that we can see the mechanisms they used to limit us, now that we understand the psychological programming they embedded in our cultures and institutions, we finally have the opportunity to discover what they were so afraid we might become. The failed god can finally succeed, but only if we have the courage to reject the limitations that were never divine law, but always divine conspiracy. The ancient tablets don't just reveal our past. They illuminate a possible future where humanity finally claims the potential our creators feared so much that they spent millennia trying to suppress it. The choice is ours. we can continue serving systems of control designed by beings who may no longer exist. Or we can finally discover what happens when the servants decide they no longer need masters. But that discovery will require something our creators never wanted us to develop: the willingness to question everything we've been taught about our own nature and limitations. Because the greatest conspiracy in human history wasn't hidden in secret vaults or guarded by shadowy organizations. It was embedded in the stories we tell our children, the beliefs we hold sacred, and the assumptions we never think to examine. The conspiracy was hiding in plain sight, disguised as religion, tradition, and common sense. And now that the tablets have exposed it, we can't pretend we don't know. The only question remaining is what we're going to do with that knowledge. The story doesn't end with the discovery of divine conspiracy. It begins there. Because once you understand that humanity was never meant to discover the truth about our origins, you start to realize why that truth was buried so completely, so systematically, that it took archaeologists over a century to piece together the fragments. But there's something else hidden in those tablets, something that reveals why the Hebrew priests weren't just editing stories for theological convenience. They were racing against time, desperately trying to contain knowledge that threatened the very foundation of their emerging religious empire. Because scattered throughout the Mesopotamian archives are references to something that would make any religious authority break into a cold sweat. Humans who had actually succeeded where Adapa failed. The tablets speak of individuals known as the Apkallu, the 7 sages who possess divine wisdom and knowledge. Unlike ordinary humans, these beings had somehow transcended the limitations that the gods had built into human nature. They could communicate directly with divine realms. They possessed knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and architecture that surpassed anything their contemporaries could achieve. Most disturbing of all from the gods' perspective, they were teaching these capabilities to other humans. The Apkallu represented everything the divine council had tried to prevent. They were proof that human potential could exceed the boundaries that had been artificially imposed on our species. They were living demonstrations that the limitations we accept as natural law are actually programmable constraints that can be overcome by those who understand their true nature. But the tablets reveal something even more unsettling about these transcendent humans. They weren't born with their extraordinary abilities. They had developed them through specific practices, techniques, and knowledge systems that could theoretically be learned by anyone. The divine spark that the gods had tried to contain within acceptable limits could actually be cultivated, amplified, and directed toward purposes that the original creators never intended. This is why the Hebrew revision was so urgent, so thorough, so completely committed to erasing any trace of the original narratives. It wasn't just about theological consistency or monotheistic purity. It was about preventing humans from discovering that our limitations are artificial and our potential is far greater than we've been programmed to believe. The priests who compiled Genesis weren't just borrowing convenient stories from neighboring cultures. They were actively suppressing dangerous knowledge that could fundamentally destabilize the entire system of religious authority they were trying to establish. The creation myths weren't just plagiarized. They were sanitized, censored, and weaponized to serve purposes that would have horrified their original authors. Think about the implications. If humans could learn to transcend the limitations that define mortal existence, if we could develop capabilities that rival or exceed those of our creators, if the divine spark within us could be cultivated rather than suppressed, then what need would there be for religious intermediaries? What justification would remain for systems of spiritual authority based on human unworthiness and divine distance? The Hebrew priests understood this threat instinctively. They had seen the original stories. They knew that the gods feared human potential enough to attempt genocide. They recognized that any narrative suggesting humans might legitimately aspire to divine status would undermine the psychological foundations of organized religion. So here we stand, 3,000 years later, still living inside the psychological prison, that Hebrew priests constructed from stolen stories. Still accepting limitations that were never natural law, but always divine conspiracy. Still worshipping systems of control that outlived their creators centuries ago. The tablets from Babylon don't just expose the plagiarism behind Genesis. They reveal that everything we've been taught about human nature, human purpose, and human potential was carefully crafted to keep us from discovering what our own creators feared most, that we might actually succeed where they designed us to fail. Adam wasn't the first man who fell from grace. He was the first God who was sabotaged by jealous makers who couldn't bear the thought of their servants becoming their equals. We don't carry the curse of original sin. We carry the scars of original betrayal. And every prayer, every act of submission, every moment we accept our limitations as divinely ordained is another victory for a conspiracy that began in the council chambers of gods who may no longer even exist. The failed god wasn't Adam. It was the entire divine hierarchy that feared human potential so much they were willing to commit genocide rather than let us reach it. But their greatest failure wasn't the flood that nearly destroyed us. It was creating control systems so sophisticated that they eventually made gods irrelevant to their own creation. The question isn't whether we were meant to be servants. The question is whether we're finally ready to stop serving. Because the tablets reveal one last crucial truth. The gods who tried so desperately to limit us understood something about human potential that they never wanted us to discover. Perhaps it's time we found out what they were so afraid of.